So this is part 2 of my commentary on Proverbs, chapter 18. I had left off with verse 10, and so I will continue with verse 11. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and as a high wall in his own conceit. So let's begin with the first half of that verse. The rich man's wealth is his strong city. The statement itself seems to be neutral, whereas the second half of the verse seems negative. So because of this makes it an interesting verse. Exactly where do I begin? How should I spin the first half of this verse? And before I get too far into it, I do this periodically in the Proverbs as an orienting measure. But let us keep in mind the nature of the Proverbs, or perhaps one of the fundamental characteristics of these Proverbs, and that is, as almost like a blank canvas, it certainly has a directing effect. We are prompted the direction that we ought to go, what topic we ought to be painting. Our hand is guided. And yet, we are presented with this blank canvas. Exactly how we make the truth known to us, exactly how we make it salient, understandable, recognizable, is up to us. It is up to the person that is reading it. And the last thing that I would say is probably the most important. That although we have substantial freedom in our ability to interpret and to paint upon that canvas that we are offered, we have to remember that there is the possibility that we may go astray. That although the canvas is blank, what is revealed to us through our efforts may not exactly be true. And what's difficult about this is that we really have to pay attention. We have to pay attention to the guide that is the verse, that is the chapter, that is the book. For within this subtlety, we find the restraints of our freedom of movement, freedom of action, the restraints to our liberation. And these constraints, although they are inhibitory, they are to be rejoiced by us when we find them, because they are the truth by which we find the righteous path. The rich man's wealth is his strong city. Now, what could be said of the rich man? Can we say a positive? Can we say a negative? Certainly we can. A man that has obtained material abundance, let's say, in the first instance, is a man of discipline, perhaps a man of character, a man that knows what he wants in life, that stays on a particular path. It is the quality that makes him disciplined, that he is committed. He understands how to provide, perhaps to integrate himself into a community. Unfortunately, none of this means that he has done so prudently, or has done so righteously, truthfully. There are men that find themselves into great wealth who have done it through rather unfortunate sacrifices. They sacrifice themselves. They sacrifice their souls, perhaps more importantly, because even within the realm of self-sacrifice, there are and there is that mode, that ritual, which we all must engage in. We must engage in it so that we can mature, grow into adulthood, and as we are in adulthood, continually reassess, self-reflect. Give up things that do not serve us. Give up things that do not serve God. Now what's interesting is that we are not talking about the rich man, per se. We're talking of his wealth. Now within the word wealth, the first thing that my mind went to, of course, is material abundance. But just like poverty, wealth has a much broader definition, I think. It includes the wealth of mind, the wealth of spirit, the wealth of health, anything that can be filled. Now the coffers, or the bank, is only one of such things that can be filled in a man's life. But I think that the interesting thing about wealth is that even if we have poverty of wealth in certain areas of our life, they can be superficially filled with that material gain. It can convince us, it can convince the self that we are worthy of our possessions. Because we have achieved, we have a right to be satisfied. Perhaps in the extreme cases, we have the right to be satisfied, to use our wealth to satisfy our desires, whatever they might be. And in this way, a strong city is created. And the language here, his wealth, is his strong city. Now, strong city, of course, it's a large symbol. It's a symbol that usually is well beyond one man. And for man to have a city, or to say something as, his wealth is his strong city, it takes this symbol of the external world, of the external environment, of the external community, and it places it within that globe of the self. And just like a city, there is much goings on. There's a lot of interaction between different elements. And it is throughout this complex interaction of the various elements of the city that give it its character. They give it its spirit. Certainly we can have a city that at once was inhabited and then at some point had become abandoned. But in such cases, the city is much reduced. Perhaps we can't even call it a city anymore, but rather a place once inhabited. But with the people within that city, within the continual genesis and this life and death cycle, not only of the people within it, but also of the various buildings that undergo construction, decay, demolition, construction, perhaps repair, this cycle within the city. Now I say all of this to just give an illustration. Again, we are painting on this canvas, this blank canvas. But we are using the infrastructure of the verse. The rich man's wealth is his strong city. So we have a strong city. What can we say of a city that is strong? The people in it are healthy. They have enough to eat. They are not burdened by crime. They are productive. They know and they work in harmony with their neighbors. They're a strong community, healthy families. All of this contributes to a strong city. The defenses of the city perhaps are strong. The wealth of the city, perhaps, in terms of its coinage, is sufficient. The city is not in debt. The politics of the city is relatively benign. The social issues are minimal. Productive citizens are able to handle their own affairs. And when disputes arise, there are effective institutions to solve those disputes. This is a strong city. Now, certainly, just as a man's wealth may not be limited or isolated to that material or to the bank account, it would seem the strong city is not just strong by its wealth. I say wealth, by its material prosperity. There's much more that goes into it. Prosperity itself is quite a substantial term. And for all of the things that I had mentioned, we consider this city to be prosperous and strong. Now we have the second half of the verse. Has a high wall in his own conceit. And now we have a rather abrupt change in direction. It seemed as though we had a neutral verse, or perhaps even a positive verse. But then as we round the corner, we find ourselves redirected. We are admonished for our original interpretation. It would seem quite an interesting light has been shed on the nature of language and interpretation. And I'll describe what I mean. In the first instance, if all we knew was the first part of that verse, we could find ourselves in both a positive and a negative territory. I think it is what, to a degree, makes the verse neutral. That is, the rich man's wealth is his strong city. Again, within a number of those words, wealth, strong, rich, we could find ourselves describing a lot of different conditions, a lot of different aspects that can produce a symbol, a fortified symbol, that rises above some superficial characteristic, some superficial meaning that impregnates the word. However, given context, again, given the negativity that we find when we round the corner, we are forced to backstep. We are forced to take away, to move up in terms of the depth of meaning. We are forced to reduce something and make it more superficial. For now, what we understand this verse to mean is associated with a prideful person, a selfish person. And when I say superficial, I don't mean to say that the verse is superficial. What I mean to say is that the action of man, in a conceitful manner, in a selfish manner, in a prideful manner, necessarily moves himself back up. Or back down, perhaps, it depends on the analogy that we want to use. Down in the sense of depth, whereas depth is greater richness, more understanding, and up would be back towards the surface, back towards superficiality, or we could think of it as going up, as in ascending the ladder towards heaven, or down, back down into the darkness. Either way, take one that works. This man necessarily moves himself towards a state of superficiality because of his inward viewing, because he has such a narrow view of wealth, because he places his faith in such lowly pillars of stability, like the wall around the city, or the monetary accumulation in his bank account, or within the city itself. These are places, if faith is placed there, are weak. They are weak, but they are also blinding, because by and through temptation, man sees these things as his salvation. They become his idol. And because he idolizes these things, he stakes himself into the ground, but tethers himself with the lightest of strings, such that when the strong winds come, the string breaks without much force. Now, in the last episode, I mentioned fractals. I mentioned the pattern that scales down to the microcosm as it does up to the macrocosm. The pattern is very similar, much like a Russian doll. The larger doll on the outside, and as you take away the layers, the dolls become smaller and smaller, but all the while staying true to their form, but just change in terms of scale. Likewise, if man's conception of wealth and of riches and of his strong city are placed within this superficial structure, it is going to scale all the way up to the defensibility of that city, all the way down to his soul. And so, in closing for this verse, I think it's interesting, the structure. It's interesting how this negativity can make us consider, or I should say the second half of the verse and its negative connotation can make us consider how it impacts the first part of that verse. How quickly something can be pierced through, this fractal can be pierced through, and all of a sudden, to us, the color changes. And we see the consequence. We see the wrong. Even though we have this canvas upon which we can paint, upon which we can illustrate, we can clearly see what we were guided to see. That this reality of ours is in fact dependent upon the various layers, and if we as people choose to accept a deficient way, a superficial way, we will come to find just how insecure those foundations are. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Now, this is a verse that we've seen before, I believe. Perhaps not in exactly the same language, but in sentiment it is similar. What does it mean to destroy? We could think to obliterate. We could think to fracture into many different pieces. We could think of disillusionment. That was something that was at once identifiable. Perhaps we can illustrate a building. A building that has grown into old age, that cannot be repaired. It must be destroyed, demolished. And within this demolition, what it was is destroyed. It is reduced. It is reduced to elements that are insufficient to sustain the identity that it once held. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty. The question here is, well, what is being destroyed? Is it man? Is it his heart? Is it his city? Is it his culture? I don't think it really matters. I think we can pick anything that we want to pick. Any one of those things, or beyond. But I think it would do us well to pick probably the most meaningful of man itself, himself, or the heart. If such things are to be destroyed, I can't imagine that type of destruction of mind, of being, the longing, the despair that it must produce, the death that it must bring. And what can we say of this haughtiness? What does that mean? How does that make us feel? How does the heart become excited under the haughty landscape, under the haughty umbrella? The haughty again. It is synonymous with the arrogant, with the vain, the superior disdain for something else. Or I should say the feelings of superiority, and by those feelings, a disdain for someone or something else. It is the lack of humility. Now, of course, the most important question we can ask at this point is, how does this virus invade that cell? How is it corrupted? How is it then destroyed? Now, the subject of the proud, of the self-centered, is a tired subject. It's a tired subject at this point in the Proverbs. It is something that is repeated over and over again. It is the long path of understanding the dangers of excess, the excesses of self, the excesses of the self-centered view, of placing the self at the center of all reality, the inability to see beyond it, above it, the inability to sacrifice for somebody else, the inability to integrate the heart to the more sophisticated and refined virtues. Now we can imagine rather comically if a cell all of a sudden became self-aware and imagined itself superior to all other cells. And perhaps we can imagine an even worse scenario if all cells became self-conscious and thought themselves superior to all of their neighbors. We can imagine in that scenario a profound stagnation and probably a relatively quick death. The cells would no longer communicate with one another. They would no longer perform the essential functions that are necessary. The cells often produce things for things beyond themselves. Of course, they also do things to maintain themselves. The maintenance of the self is not in itself a negative. The self, of course, is an identity. It is something that exists. in excess and in an improper manner of or mode of existence in which they are not working to fulfill their purpose, they and the cells around them will perish. They will be destroyed. They will die. The very thing that they are, the very thing that defines them, that identifies them as unique entities in and of themselves, will be lost because there is nothing to sustain them. And before honor is humility. Now we have an interesting contrast between this verse and the last one. The structure of this verse is opposite. We have a positive, or I should say, in this verse we have a negative above a positive. In the previous verse we had a positive, potential positive, or a neutral above a negative. This is something that highlights the point that I have made in countless episodes, that the ascent, the process by which we transcend, that we enhance our experience and understanding of the world, every time we move up the step in that ladder, in that staircase towards the top, towards God, we are faced with two paths, both of which are, I don't want to say obscured, because it's not a matter of chance. It is a matter of choice. Sometimes the information that we have is minimal, and perhaps we make the wrong decision. Perhaps we make the wrong decision and we change our hearts, we change our minds, and we return to that choice again after some difficulty. But we are always presented, much like this verse, with two sides of the coin, the two potential things that we can choose, or that we can accept, one of which requires significant sacrifice. The other is the path of temptation, is the road to destruction. It is the road to descending that staircase rather than ascending. Before honor is humility. Humility is the tempering of the self in order that one may align themselves with the truth. They cool the passions of the heart in interest of something greater than the self. It is the recognition of that which is greater, despite the pull towards that introversion and self-centeredness of the desires, of the pleasures, of the safety and of the comfort. Within the rejection of all of this for that pursuit of truth, we may find honor. This honor is respect, great esteem, it is privilege, it is glory. It is a fulfilled obligation. It is a reward for achievements, not in a selfish manner, but in a deserved manner. It is beautiful. It is magnificence. We can say of honor something that is luminous. Just much like a street lamp in the darkness of night. It spreads its rays around it to illuminate the street beneath it. And in this way, a humble man turns on his light in the darkness to illuminate that path and that way, that road, that street, upon which we navigate ourselves towards that transcendence, towards that elevation, towards God. He that answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame unto him. Now this verse is simple enough, it is straightforward enough, but we are concerned here about salience. We want to make sure we understand why this is the case. We want to make sure that we ingrain the truthfulness that we can find within the proverb. And a superficial flyover will not suffice. It takes time to imbue meaning into something that is tough, into something that is rough. Much like an engraving on a stone surface. It takes time, it takes skill, it takes care. He that answers a matter before he hears it. Now I want to start with to hear. What does that mean? Now it implies here a perception. And this perception goes beyond just that physical act of hearing. It goes beyond that the register of some sound, as perhaps somebody could say something, and we could hear that somebody has said something, but we can't make out the words that are said. In that sense, we can't hear it. In another sense, the words may have gone in, but insufficient attention may have been paid to them. And in such a case, we can also consider this to be a lack of hearing. But regardless of the context of this verse, hearing is generally thought of as picking up on some information, and then beyond that, the degree to which one pays attention to that sound. Perhaps at the top of that, we find our meaningful sounds. We find our complex speech. We find language in that realm, in which we really have to pay attention to the sounds that are occurring, so that we can make sense of them, and so that we can reply to them. And so in this verse, in the context of this verse, what is it about that process by which language enters into our ear? It vibrates those small 3 inner ear ossicles. It vibrates that tympanic membrane. It travels through the fluid in the inner ear. That fluid displaces little hair cells in that inner ear. That displacement causes depolarization of the nerve cell that lies beneath, that is sensitive to that displacement. And that stimulates an action potential, or a nerve impulse, to the brain. Once in the brain, it arrives at areas of vast neural complexity. That through the integration of this information, we are at some point able to understand speech. So again, the question is, what does it mean to hear something before we reply to it? And in what way is it folly and shame to the man that answers before this process takes place? There is a pattern that I have been formulating, that has been emerging in the Proverbs. The pattern of partiality. I've been referring to it as the superrelativism. That man in his limited capacity finds himself often within this soup. Some people find it much more difficult to deal with, and they consider this soup to be all that there is, that truth is absolutely relative, that it is something that cannot truly be grasped onto except by the individual and the individual's experience. Truth is, in that sense, made by the individual. It is not from without him or her. There is not some source of this truthfulness or understandability or intelligibility. In a similar manner, when we think of the word integration, we are thinking of something that is, at once, was a piece of information that is coming from without, that is entering into this whole. And perhaps in this way, we have a relatively simple example giving us indication that that purely relativistic mindset is not all that true, just by virtue of there being an identity that can seem like a closed system, but obviously it's quite permeable. It is able to receive, and is able to receive such that it integrates that information or combines part of something that is from without into the thing that is whole. And if we expand that, again, we're thinking fractally, if we expand that all the way out into a greater layer of sophistication in which we have interactions between people, between bodies of people, between families, between institutions, whatever, the system itself must receive information from without. Otherwise, it would be within this relativistic sphere. It would be stuck within itself. It would be subservient. It would be responsible for the generating principle. Now it is certainly capable and responsible of interpretation, of modification, of molding, of shaping, but of this generation, I don't think that this is the case. And again, because it requires information from the outside to influence that whole or that relativistic soup. Now, the information that comes in from the outside, if it is indeed language, may be untrue. But the very procedure and the very process by which we come to understand something to be true, the very prompting that a falsehood would bring to us, suggests that there is a way to see beyond that falsehood, to see above it, to see something that is greater than, transcendent, something that unites, some principle that finds a failure in the connectedness of a pattern. So what does that have to do with he that answers a matter before he hears it, that is folly and shame unto him? Well, I think that if a person chooses not to take in the information of the world or of things that are outside of him, he is at risk for this relativism. He is at risk for wickedness, for evil, for foolishness. He is at risk of social damnation, we could say, because people will pick up on this, and not listening to what somebody says is a big deal. It's a big deal because something that somebody says means something, and if it is brushed aside, and if it's not considered, then that interaction is a one-way street. If it's a one-way street, again, it leaves this singular individual, the sole arbiter of meaning, of understanding, of moving in a particular direction. It is the tyranny of ignorance to a degree. He that answers a matter before he hears it. He has not sufficiently integrated the information from the outside into the whole that is the self, perhaps. The combination of another piece of meaning within this sphere of meaning inside the mind. He that answers a matter before he hears it. This answering is interesting. The word here that is used is answering. It is not he that directs a matter before he hears it. Because essentially that is what the action is. It is a direction. That tyranny of ignorance, or the tyranny of arrogance, again, we could say, kind of different, but in the same similar lane. It is the denial of that outside piece. He that answers a matter before he hears it. There is all sorts of preconceived ideas that go into answering something before one has heard a question or whatever situation might require an answer. One of the fundamental qualities of the fool, or of folly, is that of misalignment. Misalignment with that which is from the self, from the self's behavior, from the self's understanding or willingness to understand. We can say that it lacks good sense. But even that language, it's interesting that we use the word sense, because it would imply that everything that we come to know, come to understand to be true, is backed up by some feeling. And of course, we understand that our feelings can be deceptive. But we can't confuse ourselves here, because although our feelings can be deceptive, and although our understanding, our rational direction can be misinterpreted, it can be false, we keep in mind that this, on both ends, is foolishness. The misalignment of the heart and the misalignment of the mind. And that I think it's perfectly reasonable to suspect that if somebody finds something that is true, if they are properly oriented, the opening of the heart to be responsive to the discovery of some truth ought to be in shape, we can say. It ought to be conditioned. It ought to be learned, just as the mind ought to understand how to put different pieces together, or to ask appropriate questions, and to make the appropriate steps to determine how something can be true. Both act in concert. one without the other makes being very difficult. Then the fool is the one that is teetering off that edge, off the edge of understanding, of the inability down into the darkness, the pit of Sheol, because of the lack of alignment, because of the lack of good sense. And so it is because this lack of alignment, the arrogance of not allowing that information to enter into the ear, the arrogance of believing that superiority of the self, that it is the creator of its own truth, that it believes in this absolute relativism. It pushes aside the information from without because it believes that it doesn't matter what is actually said, because what is in my mind, what I make, is more important than that thing, even if that information that comes in is false or is falsely interpreted. It makes this person a fool because in the rejection of this, they are closing themselves off. They are shutting the gate. They are closing this steel door against the very thing by which he can escape his positive feedback loop of self-deception, of misalignment, of perpetual misalignment, both of the heart and of the mind. Now, if we imagine a somatic example as we approach the second half of this verse, we've already entered into it with the discussion of the fool. It is folly and shame unto him. If we enter into this word shame, this is a difficult one because a well-misaligned person, we think, how is it possible that somebody like that can feel shame? Perhaps they are so distorted and disoriented that the heart doesn't even recognize their folly, their foolishness. And to that I would say, perhaps not the best answer, I'll give an analogy. Since we are thinking about alignment, we'll take a somatic example. Let's say we take the femur, the proximal leg bone, that large leg bone. And let's say it is a fractured bone, that it is broken in two pieces such that the superior portion, let's say it's a femoral shaft fracture, so the superior portion is moved either medially or laterally relative to the inferior portion of that femoral shaft. A clear misalignment in the two bony fragments that ought to be one continuous piece so that it can transfer the load. Now, the mechanism we have for understanding the falsehood of that misalignment is pain receptors, or I should say nociceptors, or free nerve endings, because pain is an output in the brain. It's not the information that comes up into us must be perceived. The information itself is not, it's incorrect to call that pain, but nevertheless, what makes us aware and attentive to the fact that there is something wrong, even if we don't know of the misalignment or of the nature of the wrong, because perhaps we can say that the wrong is a misalignment, a form of misalignment, whether or not we know that the literal misalignment between the two bits of the femur, it probably might be difficult to tell in such a large extremity. It's easier to tell in other extremities because of obvious deformity. But again, in this case, that perception of pain is going to be very difficult not to listen to. Very difficult not to listen to. We can choose to ignore much of it as we can so that we can still interact with people so that we are not completely incapacitated and we could solve certain problems to get ourselves into a position where some medical professional can help us handle that situation to fix that fracture so that the leg is returns to a degree of competence. And perhaps we would say not to do so, not to listen to that pain would be foolish. And it is foolish because of that alignment problem. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a fracture, but the fracture is good for an alignment, a literal alignment problem or illustration. It could be a blood clot. It has nothing to do with a literal misalignment, but it is painful. It is something that is very dangerous. It is something that can be acted on if listened to. And even if we don't know exactly what is causing it, the fact that it is happening and that it is severe is enough to indicate that there is something wrong and it ought to be paid attention to, that we ought to find a solution to that problem. And so again, here we have the listening or the hearing before the answer. And there is this, what I'm trying to get to is this shame. Because it's a feeling of distress. It's potentially a feeling of humiliation. It's caused by the awareness of wrongfulness or foolishness. Now, I think it would be quite strange to think of shame coming from a fracture of the femur or of a thrombosis in the leg. But I think to the degree that we are considering the pain and distress, if one is to ignore it, then one will come to understand the consequences if it is left ignored. And it is the understanding and that judgment that leads to the revelation. It is an awareness of the truth. It is the alignment after something that has been so poorly aligned that now the only way that they are able to understand is through judgment. You know, the system of the courts of law, the judiciary comes to mind here. If somebody's not properly oriented in society, they are not able to participate effectively. The laws are there as a last-ditch effort to give that person judgment, to essentially prompt them into shame so that they change their behavior. Surely the judgment of man is not comparable to the judgment of that divine judgment. So hopefully this matter has come full circle. He that answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame unto him. The inattentiveness to that which is prompting, the lack of humility to understand and recognize when one is misaligned. And given the case of misalignment, malalignment for an extended period, or in a significant event, what is then caused is this shame, this humility, because of the recognition of the truth that they so quickly and arrogantly denied. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit who can bear? Let's start with the spirit of a man. Now, my traditional illustration that has been said many times here, both in the Psalms and in the Proverbs, that the spirit of a man is something that is far-reaching. It is something of him that is like an essence of his being, like the smoke of a fire indicates something of the fire. If we are to smell smoke, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to experience the fire. We don't have to see it. We don't have to experience its heat to know that it is lit and it is burning. In some sense, it is of the perceptual sphere, but beyond the traditional, perhaps we should say. And here the analogy comes into a bit of difficulty because the smoke can be considered traditional sense and perception. When I mean outside of this traditional sphere, that of what we would normally consider to be our senses, taste, smell, hearing, seeing, all of this may be included when we perceive the spirit, but the spirit is more, much like I spoke of earlier about the integration of information that comes from without. And the process by which information enters the ear and enters into the mind. The spirit is perceived not necessarily limited to those senses. It is the integration of many senses, perhaps we could say. It is the ability of the mind to see beyond the physical into the transcendent sphere. Of course, one man that cannot become another, but one man can know another's spirit. And just as we know that the being of a person is not immediately visible to us, it's like the fire, and yet we could smell it from a distance. And so if we imagine a person in front of us that we are interacting with, we know that there is a being there. Of this being we can interact with. From this interaction we can gain certain perceptions that are beyond the base, beyond the intonation of their speech, beyond the smell, the physical smell of the person, beyond their physical appearance. Within that perceptual sphere of their own, from the core of their being, comes this essence, just like the smoke off that fire. And as it approaches us, we are able to perceive it. It is of this complexity of mind, and within this complexity of mind, that we are able to appreciate and interpret that is outside of our own mind, that I think we can consider the spirit. It lies within the relational realm, within the relational highway. But I think I have described but an aspect of the spirit and not of the whole of it. For I have been thinking of my own experience of how I would see another man's spirit. But what would I say about my own spirit? If I had to look within myself, If I had to ask my being, if that is indeed possible, what is your spirit? Where is it? What does it look like? How is it perceived? Would I be able to give an answer? I think the answer is yes. But it would be quite a difficult answer. And it may not be true relative to somebody else that perceives my spirit, of whom they may not be correct either. But I think it's often the case that observation from without, especially multiple instances of observation of someone's behavior, their complexity of being, the spirit that is emitted from that. Of course, these people, these nodes that we collect the data from would be quite intimately related to our subject. But I think it is likely that the people that see from without may give us a better conception of our own spirit than perhaps I myself can. And that may be a consequence of the lack of self-reflection. But if we put that aside for a moment, and I were to ask myself again, if I were to ask myself again, where is your spirit? What is it? What does it look like? How do you perceive of it? In what way will your spirit sustain you in even the mildest cases of infirmity, or in the most extreme? And of infirmity, I think weakness, physical or mental. I think fragility, frailty. So we have two questions here, one of which is partially defined, that of spirit. And then we have my individual prompting to find and to describe my own spirit. And on the other hand, we have weakness. What does it mean to be infirm? What constitutes this? And is there a way that by understanding one we can understand the other? If I had to imagine and think about my day so far, and of all of the instances where weakness arose in me, certainly there would be many. Many perhaps would be and would seem trivial, some perhaps not so trivial. A personal example today is the failure of an exercise session today. I had a goal in mind, I wasn't able to achieve it because of mental weakness. I felt too fatigued in the moment to continue and to meet the goal that I had set for myself. And certainly it was not okay that this happened. And in this instance I felt shame, I felt foolish, I felt that I had betrayed myself, that there was some part of me that knew better, that knew exactly what was best for myself, exactly how far I needed to be pushed to be satisfied, to be left alone, to be worthy of some rest. And in my denial of that voice, I think I have rejected my spirit. Now what's interesting here, what is emerging, is an inner voice that seems to understand the way that I ought to be walking. That little piece of me from the inner being, just like the noise from without that comes into my mind that I may perceive it, just like an illustration of a of a hot molten core, like the center of the earth that burns within me, that we can consider as my being. Off of this core comes this information, this wisdom from who knows where, that does know what is best, what ought to have happened in that situation. And yet this weakness, this infirmity, it happened despite that knowing. And so how and in what way was I sustained despite my failure? I think it was the recognition. It was the recognition by the part of myself that failed, in relation to the part of myself that set the goal. It was in some sense, it was the recognition, the judgment that we saw in the previous verse. That there was some misalignment that occurred. And as a result, and at the end, once I convinced myself in that moment that going farther was not going to be happen today. Pushing myself further was not going to happen. When I made that decision to stop, the shame set in. It wasn't immediate. It was after the fact. The shame set in because of the understanding of what that goal was set there to mean in the first place, and that if it was achieved, what would have been gained. It understood the truth of the goal that was set. Strange thing to refer to myself as it, to separate myself in such a way. So what then? What can we say in this case? Is the discovery of some truth that led to the infirmity. The voice of the Spirit. And I think the answer is not quite. Why is it not quite? Because we are going off of the proverb. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. The recognition itself was not the thing that sustained me in the case of my infirmity, my mental weakness. I think the sustaining element comes from hope. It comes from the idea that in the future this can be corrected. It comes from the idea that I still live, I can still experience. There's still something about myself in this moment that can still appreciate what it has despite its failures. And I think if we move back through the microcosm into the macrocosm, into the experience of man, back into a Genesis view, I think the fall of man away from that divine source, away from his relationship to God and into the profound awareness of himself. Perhaps I could say, as a substitute for the word profound, unfortunate. But that's neither here nor there. It's difficult to say exactly where the Spirit is here, what role the Spirit has. Because again, even within this idea of hopefulness, I think I have only thought of a part. Yes, I could say that in the case of that macrocosm, that the Spirit is the thing that sustains man despite his failures. But surely he had a Spirit before, both before and after Christ. Perhaps I will pause this matter here for today, and I'll continue tomorrow. And so when I continue, it may seem a bit disjointed. It may take me a while to come back up to speed, but this matter of determining man's relationship to the Spirit, and perhaps what it is, I think is important, at least to begin the conceptualization. Surely, a definitive conclusion may not be arrivable with just one verse. Now I hesitate to continue with the line that I had left off with about the death and resurrection of Christ. I think it is directly related to what I'm talking about here, but I think we may get too far into the weeds. And since we are in the Proverbs, I think we ought to save that conversation for that part of the text. Though surely it would provide us with some context if it were mentioned. So perhaps just briefly I'll mention one pattern that I think is useful here. That of the death of Christ on the cross, the sacrifice of himself, the man that possesses the divinity. Through his sacrifice, in the context of his life lived, he died for our sins, so that we may become closer to God, so that our sins are not this eternal judgment, preventing us from making any action, constantly polluting our spirit. Perhaps, as it says in this verse, the spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. Perhaps the spirit of man at that point in history was no longer sustaining his infirmity. Perhaps man up to that point was so burdened by that infirmity that the spirit was unable to handle it underneath the weight. But a wounded spirit, who can bear? The second half of that verse. Now, through the relationship that was broken by sin, restored by the death of Christ upon the cross, we have a sustaining element that's reintroduced, perhaps, into the heart of man, into the spirit of man, that would then sustain his infirmity. Now, the point that I was making was that surely man had the Spirit available to him before the death of Christ. After, those who were aware, and of those who chose to follow in the ways of Christ, I think, were able to more firmly solidify the relationship. Again, to sustain their infirmity better than those who did not accept that teaching that perhaps allowed them to ascend a few more levels in that conscious sphere towards that divine point, that divine logos. Through the resurrection, man has been given this new life, this new hope. It's a victory over death and sin. It is the promise of an eternal place. Of course, what it means for this eternal place to manifest, I think, is a difficult one to discuss, but again, that is for a different point in the text. For now, we are concerned with the spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. Essence. A difficult word, I think. It depends on how it's used. It depends on where it comes from. The word essence comes from the Latin word essentia. It means the being or essence of a thing. Of course, that doesn't help us much. It is a compound word made up of the prefix x or ex. It means out of, and the word esse, meaning to be. And if we were to take this out of and to be, I think that this is useful for the way I wish to use the word. Now there are additional ways that this word can be used, ways in which the word has transformed and has been made into our colloquial understanding, which perhaps is not too different from the way that I am going to attempt to use it. That is, of this base sense, base in the sense of foundational, out of, to be, out of that which is, full stop, or out of that thing that is, out of the thing that is considered to be something. Now this word has been used in Greek as being itself. It's been used to refer to the fundamental nature of reality. In English, it's been used to describe the essential nature of something. The essence of a plant or of some philosophical concept. And so I think we can use both. That it is a perceptible piece of my essential being. It is out of my being. Again, the smoke from the fire analogy. And I think both in terms of my perception and that of the perception of somebody from without me, I think, I want to say ironically, this is true. Ironically in the sense that if we consider me as the self, thinking about his essential being, the irony is that that rational self-awareness has difficulty understanding what that is, almost as if it is so abstracted from being itself that it is not part of that thing that we are talking about. Perhaps this is a dangerous territory to be in, to find the mind so separated from its being, from its spirit. For in such a case, what can a man know of his spirit, and how will it sustain him in his infirmity? But that is the essential question. Underlining that word, the essential question. within that word is essence. Within essence is the nature of that being. The being of that question. I've decided that it is nonsense to be fearful of the abstracted self trying to see its essence in the mirror. I think this self-reflection, although bizarre in the sense that the being and the essence don't seem to follow it into this inward view. Now there is a danger, no doubt, but I don't think the danger is great enough or ought not to inhibit the sacrifice. And when I say sacrifice, well, what is it exactly is being sacrificed? Well, I think in a sense, what's being sacrificed is security. Security in the sense that if one is to move too far inward, I run the risk of becoming this wicked, self-absorbed person, the fool. But if this self-reflection on that scale doesn't take place, then perhaps understanding might be obscured. It might be hindered. And so before I enter, and perhaps this is a bit after the fact, because I think that there was a degree of entering earlier, but before I enter now, I think I ought to send up a small letter to sacrifice something of my conscious experience and say, I'm leaving doors open so that the breeze of the night can come in to find me. Like Hansel and Gretel, I'm leaving breadcrumbs along the trail so I can find my way back. Where is he, the man that speaks? How can I find where he dwells? I can hear him, but I can't feel him at the moment. What exactly should this being look like? Certainly I'm not looking for a material object. Am I looking for an illustration, a painting on the wall that explains to me the nature of this spirit, the essence of this being, the answer to the problems that I face? The answer to dissolve that infirmity of mind in the cases of weakness. How can I appeal as I look towards that inner darkness, towards the light of being? How can I appeal to it that it will come out of the shadow? That it will tell me, here is your spirit, take it with you in cases of struggle and hardship. Let it go in front of you, and let it fill the world. And let it come back to you and explain to you and warn you of the encroaching infirmity. Let it always be known to you exactly where within this space the Spirit chooses to rest his head. Let it be known to you that if you want something, the continuity is offered by that Spirit. You will not need those breadcrumbs to find your way back. The Spirit will offer you that way. And what of the burning? What of that frightful burning? In a sense it is damnation, in a sense it is sin, it is the weakness, it is the straw upon the weight that is ever so heavy that it breaks the foundation beneath. What can you provide me? What sort of solace can this Spirit of the man, of this man, provide? How can it say, how can it confidently commit itself to the foundations that have been set before it? How can it do such a thing with such a profound lack of understanding? How can it do such a thing after such an experience of failure? But who can bear a wounded spirit? It seems there's not much choice in the matter. Either there is an acceptance of that continuity, which is fundamentally known. Perfection may come and it may go, but it's for God to decide. Your spirit is enough. Let it go and let it find God. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity. Let it dwell within his house. The heart of the prudent getteth knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeketh knowledge. You know, one has to wonder, today I had an exchange with a person that had a particular view about a particular situation that seemingly was not improving, although this person was taking steps to rectify the situation. And I was faced with a dilemma. On one hand, I could acknowledge the person's attitude, the attitude of frustration, hopelessness. Hopelessness might be a bit extreme, but certainly frustration. Or on the other hand, to provide hope, to say that because you are taking the steps to rectify the situation, much like a tree that is planted, it's difficult to see its growth from day to day, but perhaps given a long enough span of time, that tree will certainly grow into something that is impressive. It will reach a state of security and stability that one hopes for when they plant a tree. It provides the shade, it provides the general, it increases that atmosphere that we all I think we all understand intuitively of nature. That we are in the presence of large and old trees. There's something peaceful about it, there's something healing about it. And in a like manner, this seed that is to grow into a large tree was akin to my explanation to this person, that the problem that they are attempting to solve is much like that small seed. It's difficult to see its growth given a short time frame, but given long enough, there will be an undeniable change, that seed will grow into a strong tree. And of course, the requirements for that growth is that discipline and that commitment to solving the problem. The heart of the prudent getteth knowledge. I think this is the heart of the proverb, perhaps in one sense. For what can we say of the prudent? And perhaps if we move back a little bit more from that, just as a general thought about the Proverbs themselves thus far, just like the analogy of that tree that grows over time, it seems as though, but it's difficult to say, that as we move through the Proverbs, and we remain diligent, and we remain discerning, curious, inquisitive, and disciplined, what is shown to us is greater than what we were able to see at the beginning. Because of this discipline and because of the continuation, the commitment to that growth, we are the seed that is committed to that growth. But we are also the observer. Now, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but certainly the observer must be put in its proper place. Otherwise, it may disrupt that process of growth, as slow as it may be. Now, the other thing that I would like to say about this, the first part of this verse here, the heart of the prudent getteth knowledge. And this may be difficult to articulate, but I'm imagining this situation of the observer, but also the foundation of being, that is the person. That is the person, even there's trouble with that language. The foundation of being, that's center to that person. It's the core. It's certainly difficult to describe, but this prudence is a fundamental matter. It represents, I think, both care for the future, but also it represents a degree of judiciousness, a degree of good sense, of applying accurate judgment, to different situations, to solving different problems. And I had mentioned in my analogy of the planting of the tree and the man that says that is frustrated with the growth of that tree because it's so slow, and perhaps that they don't see much of its growth. We have two situations here. We have the seed that was planted by the man, and that continues to grow, and he continues to nourish it. But on the other hand, we have the lament of the man, that despite his efforts, he cannot see the change. And that's a bit of a dilemma. And I had mentioned the observer. The observer is sort of like this man that is wanting, that is trying to develop this seed into something fruitful and plentiful. But then for whatever reason, he finds it within his heart. The desire goes south. That frustration, which certainly is a matter of the heart, bubbles to the surface. Now, what of his prudence in this situation? Certainly, we could say, on one hand, that this person demonstrates prudence, for he continually cares for this seed. And certainly we can accept that despite our analogy of the slow-growing tree, there is always the possibility that the tree is not growing, that in fact it is diseased and it is dying. In both cases, the man makes the decision to be prudent. But to be prudent to a degree. His prudence does not extend to his heart. We can say perhaps that his heart is betrayed, or his heart is not betrayed, his heart betrays that prudence from within him, wherever we might say that it comes from his rational self, from that willful acceptance, from that faith. That somewhere in there, because of that faith, there is an unrealized, another way of saying perhaps unrealized is a thought, a belief that has not yet been made explicit and remains implicit. It remains buried well beneath the surface. And yet, much like, what could we say? Much like, this might seem like a strange analogy, but a dishwasher usually has a hot drying cycle, and it gets really hot, and that warmth extends to the countertop above it. You can use any sort of physical analogy of warmth beneath a surface, and that surface absorbs that heat and transmits it to the surface by which a person can perceive it. But the point is, then even if we don't necessarily see or directly experience that heat, that drying cycle, it makes its presence known at the surface by that dissipation of heat through the countertop. And I think it depends on the prudent person, the discerning person, to feel that warmth on that surface and listen to it. Say, okay, there's something going on here, and I I ought to think a little bit more about what this might be. And I think that that is showing a form of judiciousness, a sagaciousness, a shrewdness, wisdom. Humility is the acceptance of something that is unknown despite a particular feeling. Of course, this acceptance is spurred on by the willful curiosity. The heart of the prudent getteth knowledge. Now, so let's return to this illustration. The two possible paths. The tree is dead in one situation. The tree is alive in another, and yet it is just sort of slow growing, like a tree does. And we have the man that is sort of incomplete. He has this buried prudence. His heart is deceptive, and perhaps it is beginning to erode his faith. Again, regardless of the condition of the tree, the optimal state of the man is the proper orientation of the heart. So that is, even if the heart feels a certain way, that feeling ought not to be oriented towards frustration and of the denial of his discipline in his hard work, his discerning nature, his prudence. Rather, it should be a moment to accept, moment of acceptance and surrenderance, perhaps I could say, in the sense that, although the feeling is negative, the man is listening to the feeling, he is showing prudence, just as one can perceive of some process occurring beneath the surface that is interpreted because of the heat from beneath, that is similar to this feeling from beneath. So he listens to it. He exercises prudence not only in his desire to grow the tree, but also in the question that stems from his heart, that prompts him, as the Proverbs do, into a mode of reflection. And in this mode of reflection, he can sort out the possibility of the tree being dead or dying, or his discontent, his impatience that revolves around the slow growth of the tree. And through that process, he gets knowledge, because he can devise a way to measure growth of the tree, a way of measuring that is beyond his immediate perception. So it would be a sacrifice of immediate gratification. And also, perhaps he can go for counsel. He can ask somebody that knows about trees. He can explain the situation, explain the characteristics of the tree, thereby exploring both paths at once to determine which one is true. And in so doing, he gets this knowledge, he gets this understanding. And the ear of the wise seeketh knowledge. And we've seen this sort of thing in the Proverbs before, when we have a mismatch of organ and sense perception. We have the ear, and then we have seeking, which I often attribute to vision. But I suppose it doesn't have to be. For after all, this seeking is an attempt to find something. If we are looking for something, we are actively attentive to that thing which we are looking for. And if we are within the process of attentively looking for something, it means we are receptive. that the ear is seeking in the sense that it is open to what it is after. It is after that knowledge and truth. If it is closed to it, of course it won't hear it. I can't imagine how many situations in my life I've been in where there has been multiple different noises in a room. Some of them conversational, some of them perhaps just background music. Perhaps there's a conversation that I'm engaged in. Perhaps there's a conversation across from me. Perhaps there are exchanges between people. There's behavior that is being performed, all of which is available to my senses, to my ears, to my eyes, to my nose, etc. And yet I choose to pay attention to the conversation that's in front of me, because I want to hear what the person is saying, for whatever reason. Now, if we expand this out and say, well, what is it outside of our immediate surroundings that we ought to be paying attention to? What is it beyond our immediate selfish desire that we should be paying attention to? And it's a difficult question, because we can say truth, we could say knowledge, but that won't get us out of that soup of relativism. We'll find the truth, and we can ride the wave as much as we can, but that would sort of make us a bizarre pantheist. It would not ascend us in any way. We would just be circling within this soup. I think the answer is to find those transcendent pieces of the fractal. It is to find the outer layer of that Russian doll. Each time we do, we transcend. We find a new layer of understanding, a new way of seeing, a deeper way of seeing, a feeling of being. And so I think in this way, the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. A man's gift maketh room for him, and bringeth him before great men. Now there's a few different meanings of the word that we can plug into gift, and proceed with the verse according to that meaning. We can say that of a gift, it is something that is willfully given, without some compensation. We can also say of a gift, natural talent. We can also think of it as both. A gift that is of natural talent, and also something that is offered without the expectation of payment. And I think that this value, this virtue, is desired in large part by corporate America, of entrepreneurs in general, because they want people that are willing to sacrifice for their ideas, for their company. Now, of course, once somebody demonstrates that and shows that they have real value, the other sense of that gift, that there is this innate talent or ability that has been pursued and perfected and is offered to that corporation, then that individual receives substantial remuneration. Now, I happen to think that this relationship is not all that healthy in many situations. And when I say not all that healthy, I don't necessarily mean work-life balance. I don't mean the amount of money that's involved. I mean healthy in terms of the man's soul, in terms of who he is serving, what he is serving for. Now, perhaps there are some righteous corporate institutions, corporate bodies out there, but for the most part they seek to desire the needs of man's selfish pursuits, or they are the result of, the corporate bodies are the result of a single person's or a small group of people's selfish pursuits. Again, this is not in totality. And I think that significant prosperity can occur given a certain fundamental underlying substrate of behavior and of societal stability that can work within this sphere of self-gratification, of materialism, of consumerism. But to its extreme, I think that although the system is fine in and of itself, the behavior of those within that system cause it to become this cancerous, monstrous thing, that what is within the garden is no longer fruit, but rather tyrants and predatory animals that seek to devour, to consume, and to destroy, or to pervert, to corrupt, etc. A man's gift maketh room for him. So essentially, I think the exercise that I just went through there was moving through a layer, a fractal layer. And it's not necessary to move through that fractal layer to understand the verse, but I think that understanding that a man's gift maketh room for him, it may be true in this corporate sense, but then if we move out of that layer, we say, okay, so his gift is serving what? It is serving this end, and if it is indeed a negative end, then we have to wonder the unfortunate situation of the man's gift and his sacrifice. And I should reiterate that I don't have an issue with capitalism. I don't necessarily have an issue of material abundance. Everything in its proper place. Which implies this fractal structure. That everything does indeed have a place. Now the sorting mechanism to get there, to get to a good place, is difficult. And surely utopianism in the human context is, I don't want to say a fallacy, but it is a hopeless pursuit. That we do have to accept our nature while also trying to strive towards this possible perfection, but again settling for what we can control. But even that, I think that there is something a bit off about. It's a difficult paradox that the want for perfection and utopianism causes this inner turmoil and suffering. And yet, if one is to say that we ought to accept our situation, we ought to remain humble, we don't want to find ourselves in a situation of accepting something that we can otherwise change. We don't want to have to suffer otherwise unnecessarily. But perhaps this is a violation of humility. I'm uncertain. But anyway, regarding this verse, putting aside the embeddedness of the man's gift, a man's gift maketh room for him. That it certainly does. Again, this corporate structure, I think the corporate example, rather, is a good example that the person has skill, has talent, and has, more importantly, the desire to offer, to sacrifice that talent towards something greater than himself. Now, the ideal example would be towards God, that if he decides to start his own corporate institution, he decides to bring people into him, to congregate and to think of a way to offer something to somebody else or to the population. This is ideal. And the second half of the verse, it just flows from what we've been saying, and bringeth him before great men. Because other men that pursue that high goal, that are after that peak of the mountain, will be funneled into this communion of people. He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him. So to understand this verse, we have to understand what it means for this person to have a cause, and what it means to be first at his cause. And there is a suggestion in the first half of this verse that to be first in one's own cause appears to be right, but appearances can be deceiving. That's what I'm getting from those contextual cues. So let's start with this cause then. Now, with the assistance of the dictionary here, I'm formulating an idea of what a cause might mean. And so I want to rattle off a few definitions. And I don't think that defining words are as simple as one definition. Many words have multiple definitions, especially words that have a lot of meaning endowed within their structure. Moreover, from that, words that have multiple definitions, or multiple meanings, I think sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, there is a relationship between different definitions of the same word. And that is an interesting sort of thing, in my opinion. But to begin with here, the first definition of cause is as follows: a person or thing that gives rise to an action, phenomenon, or condition. Reasonable grounds for doing, thinking, or feeling something. 2. A principal aim or movement that, because of a deep commitment, one is prepared to defend or advocate. 3. A matter to be resolved in a court of law. An individual's case offered at law. Now at the outset, I think the uniting feature here is fundament. I think of source. From the source, there is reason, there is grounds for justification. Additionally, we can think of an idea or some principle. Now, this is sort of loosely related to the fundament. Now, principle, I think, is fairly related to fundament, but in terms of idea, it is the fundament of something. Whether it is a correct idea or not, it doesn't really matter. The point is that there is this expansive illustration that is forming, much again like the seed of a tree that then blossoms into something that is well beyond its original structure or form. Now, of causes, when I look back in my mind, I think of two paths. I think of the snapshot view of causes, of causality, that we might say that what caused the tree to grow was the man that planted the seed. And yet we can take another view, which is more video-esque. It is multi-frame. It is the not necessarily a single event. Again, it's video-esque. It's not one image. It is a bunch of images placed together such that we see the continual process, that there is some origin, and then there's a sequence of causes that lead then to the mature tree. What's interesting about the word cause as we think about it in this way, we can think about the illustration as a large image that encapsulates start to finish in a video. And yet the video, start to finish, within its individual frames, has different points of causes, perhaps we can say. There are different situations, different places that we can observe that thing that gives rise to a phenomenon. Different stages in the tree's development and the nourishment of cells. We see a movement that perhaps in a bizarre way we can say is committed, staying consistent with the definition here. We see some end, some objective in which the process of life moves towards. Of course, this is within our example, our illustration of the growth of this tree. Another interesting reflection, I think, is that definition 3 compared to definition 1 seem to be looking at the word from two different places, from two different vantage points. That is, in the third instance, we have a matter that can be resolved in a court of law. That is, one party and another party are in some disagreement about the fundament or some cause. And the institution, the judge and the jury, are there to dive into, to look down into, and trace back to the root, to the principle, and find the truth and find that cause. Whereas in the first instance, a person or thing that gives rise to an action, phenomenon, or condition, we have the source, we have the origin, we have the root. It is not something that has occurred and now we are within the courts propositioning a judicial system. In this first definition, we are the arbiters, we are the generators of this action or phenomenon or condition. And from the Latin origin, causa, which has meanings including reason, motive, origin, and lawsuit. In all cases, we are concerned about this process of bringing something to be, to produce, to set into motion. So we return to the verse, perhaps a little bit more confused than when we started. Perhaps not. But let's zoom out farther from the word cause and include his own. So now we have his own cause. What can we say of this? His own. I think of belonging. I think of that interior self. I think of that city. The city that represents the self, with all of its going-ons, with all of its individual elements, with all of its parallel processing, with all of its insecurities, its boundaries, its borders, its walls. with its attempts to grasp onto the various elements that make it up, so that it can be considered something that is whole, that is one, that we can consider ourselves something identifiable, that we have a self. His own cause, this cause that belongs to himself, the foundation, the root, the source, the origin, that thing that gives rise to action, phenomenon, or condition, that principle or aim or movement that because of a deep commitment one is prepared to defend or advocate. The matter that we are concerned about, that we take to another for counsel, to define and to determine the root, again, of this thing that we are concerned with. But again, this cause is our own. At least we are assuming it to be in this verse. Now, for man to have a cause, I think, is not a simple matter. For what does it mean if we were to expand our definition of that self to the image and illustration of planting that seed for which the tree grows? What seed does man carry within his mind that can be considered something unique to him, that is, something causal, something that he brings forth? The starting point of man, some seed or germ within his mind. What is it? What can it be? Can we say it's desire? Can we say that it is will? Can we say that it is something that is given to us, something that is implanted into us? Can we say that it is the love of our parents? Perhaps the light of the divine? Perhaps all of the above can be things that can be thought of as potential places of origin for which some behavior or action stems from. It is some cause, the foundation, the root of something. But here again, we are not, perhaps we are, but we are not there entirely. We have arrived in the general vicinity. We still must hammer down what his own cause is. For we can't understand what it means for him to be first if we don't understand what his own cause is. Or rather, I should say, we can't understand what it means for him to be first in his own cause if we don't understand what his own cause can possibly be. And here comes into mind my initial two-path example. It is the image in the video. It is one snapshot versus however many bits that we can take in and perceive. And one has to wonder about these levels, the difference between the snapshot and the series of images that are so close together that they seem to transmit a level, a layer of reality that is much beyond that of the still image. There is just more information. And from more information, more data, more ability, greater ability to recognize patterns, to integrate the patterns into some broader whole. And so I think, again, within this example, within the simple, as it moves into that complex, we lose the ability to continually analyze that piece, that causal event, just over and over and over again, interpret the data, process the data. But on the other hand, as time continues, and as this reality, the process of life and the example of the tree as it grows, as that unfolds, we see the nestedness of these causal patterns repeating over and over again to produce something that is more and more sophisticated. Now, when I say causal pattern, in my mind I'm thinking this pattern of the return to some fundamental thing, the repeating. So if we imagine a source of something, so something must occur for something else to stimulate something else to occur, to stimulate something else to occur. There's sort of this chain reaction, but it's not a simple linear chain reaction. It is, and it does grow in complexity. And as the complexity grows, the relationality between the constituent bits, constituent pieces of data, the patterns that are represented, the patterns that are identifiable, their relationship to one another becomes more and more sophisticated as this tree grows. He that is first in his own cause. Now I have difficulty understanding what exactly this means for the seed in the man's mind to grow into this tree. It seems like I'm diving into a mirror that is reflected into another mirror, and there is just repeating images of myself over and over and over again. I find it quite difficult to find anywhere to lay my hand down and say, no, this is where I need to start from. This is my source. This is my beginning point, the root. He that is first in his own cause. There is also part of me that wishes to find a cause that I can place into this representation that is quite fundamental, that is not as superficial as desire, let's say. I'm looking for something that is directed, that is something that is known. But of man, what can be said of this? He that is first in his own cause seems just. So perhaps what we have here is an assertion, some causal assertion. We have something that gives rise to something else, something that is created within the mind of man, for he has the ability to think, he has the ability to act according to his will. He is bound by certain restraints, no doubt, but he has within those restraints the ability to act. He that is first in his own cause seems just. So he has put forth this causal event. Let's say, just like the seed produces this causal event, that we have moved away from the linear representation and into something that is more expansive, more integrative, more relational. In such a way, man's conception of the world, perhaps, may be represented. In such a sense, the seed is his idea. This idea grows, it expands, it interacts, it bumps up against the world. As it grows and it expands, whether it is true or not, we are not even concerned with at the moment. We are interested in the growth within this perceptual sphere, maybe we can say the heavenly sphere, or just beneath the heavenly sphere. Well, certainly it would be in the heavenly sphere that is beyond the earthly. And so we have this undulating mass, this expansion of cloud. I think of the rolling clouds that roll in sort of a time lapse of these rolling clouds, storm clouds as they roll in over a landscape. It is quite sort of like an ominous sort of thing. It doesn't have to be ominous. But nonetheless, as these clouds roll in, the ideas expand, and it hits different nodes in, what can we say, the development, the transcendence. Eventually what we have is this web, this massive web of conceptual, perceptual understanding of the world and of the self. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think that this proverb is indicating that he that is first in his own cause seems just, because since he is the source of that entire web, that entire thing that he has built into his being, he is confident in what he knows. He truly believes in his sense of justice, in his ethical leanings. He truly believes in his ability to determine what is true. He truly believes, he has faith in his conception, the seed that he planted. But his neighbor comes and searches him. Now, before we get into the second half of that verse, I think the seems just is worth mention, is worth exploring. I think this seems just indicates that it really is not just, or at least the way that this process has unfolded and solidified is a bit of a mistake. It's a bit off. And I can't help but thinking that man, as he does this, finds himself in a very sticky situation after building such an extensive and, in many cases, surely an impressive conceptualization of the self. Being able to sacrifice in such a way that would correct the first cause of his being must be a terrible thing to do. And I think that I may be mistaken, this is just an idea, but I wonder at this effect of the crucifixion of Christ and what this has done for us. This has allowed us to be able to, in such cases, to rewind that tape, to be born again, and to accept the seed from without, rather than to take that selfish seed from within and plant that and let it grow. Let it grow in such a way that is relative, it is pantheistic to an extent, that is, it sees the patterns in the world, but it chooses perhaps to unify the patterns of the world based on the conception of the self. That the self is the supreme deity, it is the divine logos. And I said pantheism, I don't think that's correct there. I wanted to say polytheism, but polytheism, it wouldn't quite make much sense. The patterns that he interprets may be polytheistic in nature, but he unifies them on himself. It is a circular existence. It doesn't really make much sense. But his neighbor comes and searches him. So what could this possibly mean? Now, for a neighbor to come, What is a neighbor? Somebody that lives next door. It is somebody that is close to us. Now, a quick search here has revealed a basic etymology from Old English. I'm not going to try and pronounce the word, but it's split into two separate words, or two separate, what can we say? Yeah, we'll say two separate words. One meaning near, and one meaning dweller. Near dweller, okay, that's not far from our understanding of neighbor. It is our understanding of neighbor, in fact. But this near dweller, what does that mean? I think it's interesting because it means, and it implies something of the community. For you're probably not going to live very near to somebody that you find dangerous, at least not for long, or if you do, it's going to be a terrible thing. Rather, I should say, one probably wants to live near to somebody that is similar to them in terms of what they value. If one has children, that's probably the best stimulus, the best cause, the root for wanting a good neighbor, or a neighbor to be, again, somebody that has children that value similar things. And so this person that values similar things, perhaps not similar in terms of worldview, but similar enough to maintain that community element. Now, ideally, at least traditionally, it probably would have been similar worldview these days. Contemporary United States, I have to wonder about that, but nonetheless, his neighbor comes and searches him. And what does it mean to search him? I think of a police search in the night, looking through the forest to find a missing person. In the news recently, there was a girl that was abducted. It made national headlines, and she was found. I guess some guy had taken her from her parents when she was out on vacation or something. But the point is, the police must have been out there searching for her. They were looking for her. And why were they searching for her? They were searching for her because they did not know where she was. When they find her, she is illuminated, let's say it's at night, just for the sake of the ambiance here. They illuminate her with their flashlights. Now, all of a sudden, they can perceive that this girl is alive. She was not murdered. She was indeed taken. But now she is found. She is found by other beings. Now what I'm getting from this, but his neighbor comes and searcheth him, is not necessarily that, and there's two paths here. There's one in which we can consider, I think this is probably a good path to have, but it probably veers into another main channel. But I think of this path, we can say that the neighbor is searching for his neighbor that is lost. Or we can say his neighbor is searching for something, this neighbor is searching us. Let's say we are this neighbor that is being searched. I'm being searched by my neighbor because they don't understand me. They must find me within that darkened forest. They must illuminate me with their flashlight. And so this tributary moves back into the main channel because his neighbor comes and searcheth him. It is not that the person is lost. There's a degree of known there. It is not like I was abducted and they're trying to find me in a similar sort of way. They're searching for something. They're searching for something within something that is known, but not something that is clear. Perhaps they want clarity. And I think this pursuit of clarity is the thing that threatens his, let's say, since I am the person that is being searched here, I am threatened because I am first in my own cause. And it seems to my neighbor that this is just at the outset, but he understands that context of seems, and he is unsure. He finds that there is something beneath the surface that ought to be known, perhaps to protect himself, to keep himself safe. Perhaps there is something about me as his neighbor and my understanding of the world that he does not understand. That my opinion of the world is so abstract and incorrect that it could potentially be my own undoing, or his undoing, or a threat to the community. And I think since we have that seeming just from one's own first cause, I think there is something to be said about the dangers of that seed of selfishness, of the centricity of the self compared to everything else around it. Because the self would become lost within that sea of relativism. Everything that is true would be true relative to himself, whatever that might mean, dependent on his own desire. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with Proverbs chapter 18. So we finish with verse 17, we'll continue with verse 18.